Story number 1. The passenger in my back seat. I should have trusted my gut the moment I pulled up to the curb. The snow was falling thick, muting the sound of the city, and the streetlights flickered like they were struggling to stay alive. The man standing under the dim glow of the lamp was wearing a dark coat, his hood pulled low, his face barely visible. I hesitated. Something about him felt off, but a job was a job, and I had bills to pay. I unlocked the doors, and without a word, he slid into the back seat. He didn't greet me, didn't even look at me, just sat there, silent. "Hey, how's it going?" I asked, glancing at the rearview mirror. Nothing. No response. Just the dull sound of his slow, deliberate breathing. I cleared my throat. "So, where to?" Still nothing. I tapped the screen of my phone, checking the ride details. The drop-off point was nearly an hour away, on the outskirts of town, an area I rarely got rides to, especially in the middle of a snowstorm. I adjusted my mirror to get a better look at him. He was facing forward, completely still. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of his hood, and for some reason, I couldn't make out his features at all. It was as if the darkness around him was thicker than the rest of the car. "All right, off we go," I muttered, pulling onto the main road. The snowfall had worsened, blanketing everything in white. The further we drove, the quieter the world became. The city lights faded in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the storm. Street after street, I kept stealing glances at him. He never moved, never shifted, never even breathed loud enough for me to truly hear. I turned on the radio to cut the silence, but the second I did, static blared through the speakers. A high-pitched, grating noise that sent a chill crawling up my spine. I twisted the dial, flipping through stations. But they were all the same. Static, whispers, and something else buried beneath it. A faint voice, muttering words I couldn't understand. I shut it off. The silence was better. The longer we drove, the heavier the air in the car became. It was like the heat had been sucked out, leaving a bone-deep cold that made my breath visible in front of me. I cranked the heater, but it did nothing. My fingers were starting to go numb. I checked the mirror again. He was still there, still unmoving, but something was different. His hood. I could have sworn it had been pulled down further before. Now, I could see the faint outline of his chin, the curve of his cheek. But no features, just the shape of a face without any detail. My stomach twisted. I gripped the wheel tighter, my pulse hammering in my ears. I had to be imagining it. The storm, the tension, my own paranoia. It was getting to me. A deep breath. Keep driving. 30 minutes passed. The roads were empty, the storm relentless. I felt trapped inside a snow globe, the swirling white outside making it impossible to tell where the road ended and the sky began. And then he moved. Not much. Just a slight tilt of his head. But it was enough. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. "We're about halfway there, man." Nothing. I checked the mirror again, but my fingers slipped on the wheel as I sucked in a sharp breath. His head had tilted more. Too much. An unnatural angle, like his neck had been stretched beyond what was humanly possible. And now I could see something beneath his hood. A grin, a wide, unnatural grin stretching across his face, teeth too sharp, too perfect, too white against the darkness of his skin. My throat dried up. My instincts screamed at me to stop the car, kick him out, get away. But we were in the middle of nowhere. The snowstorm had swallowed everything. I couldn't risk getting stranded. I pressed down on the gas just a little. The car surged forward. The silence inside the car grew louder, pressing against my skull. I didn't dare look at the mirror again. Didn't dare acknowledge that something was very, very wrong. And then he laughed, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the seat, through my bones. It didn't sound human. It was wet, distorted, like it was coming from deep within his chest. The headlights flickered, the engine groaned, and my phone, dead. The screen, black. "Hey, man," I tried again, my voice shaking now. "You all right back there?" The laughter stopped. The air grew impossibly still. And then, finally, he spoke. "You picked me up before." My fingers clenched the steering wheel so tightly they ached. No, that wasn't possible. I had never seen this man before in my life. I don't think so, man," I forced out. "Yes." His voice was like ice, cutting through the space between us. Many times. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I hit the gas harder. The car roared forward, but the road wasn't changing. The same stretch of highway kept repeating. The same crooked road sign, half buried in snow. The same bent streetlight, flickering like a dying heartbeat. We were trapped. I gritted my teeth. No, I wasn't crazy. This wasn't real. I had to get out of this. I slammed my foot on the brake. The tires skidded against the ice, the car jerking violently to a stop. My breath came in ragged gasps. I turned around, ready to order him out, to do anything to break whatever spell was happening. But the back seat, empty. The door hadn't opened. There were no footprints in the snow outside, no sign anyone had ever been there at all. The engine groaned, the headlights flickered, and the world around me seemed to fold in on itself. Then, from the rearview mirror, his face closer, grinning, "See you next time." The car's lights cut out, the storm swallowed everything, and then I woke up, sitting in my parked car, engine off. Snow piled high around me. The ride request was still on my screen, unaccepted, but in the back seat, pressed into the frost-covered window. A handprint. I should have trusted my gut the moment I pulled up to the curb. The snow was falling thick, muting the sound of the city, and the streetlights flickered like they were struggling to stay alive. The man standing under the dim glow of the lamp was wearing a dark coat, his hood pulled low, his face barely visible. I hesitated. Something about him felt off, but a job was a job, and I had bills to pay. I unlocked the doors, and without a word, he slid into the back seat. He didn't greet me, didn't even look at me, just sat there, silent. "Hey, how's it going?" I asked, glancing at the rearview mirror. Nothing. No response. Just the dull sound of his slow, deliberate breathing. I cleared my throat. "So, where to?" Still, nothing. I tapped the screen of my phone, checking the ride details. The drop-off point was nearly an hour away, on the outskirts of town, an area I rarely got rides to, especially in the middle of a snowstorm. I adjusted my mirror to get a better look at him. He was facing forward, completely still. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of his hood, and for some reason, I couldn't make out his features at all. It was as if the darkness around him was thicker than the rest of the car. "All right, off we go," I muttered, pulling onto the main road. The snowfall had worsened, blanketing everything in white. The further we drove, the quieter the world became. The city lights faded in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the Storm. Street after street. I kept stealing glances at him. He never moved, never shifted, never even breathed loud enough for me to truly hear. I turned on the radio to cut the silence, but the second I did, static blared through the speakers. A high-pitched, grating noise that sent a chill crawling up my spine. I twisted the dial, flipping through stations, but they were all the same. Static, whispers, and something else buried beneath it. A faint voice, muttering words I couldn't understand. I shut it off. The silence was better. The longer we drove, the heavier the air in the car became. It was like the heat had been sucked out, leaving a bone-deep cold that made my breath visible in front of me. I cranked the heater, but it did nothing. My fingers were starting to go numb. I checked the mirror again. He was still there, still unmoving. But something was different. His hood. I could have sworn it had been pulled down further before. Now, I could see the faint outline of his chin, the curve of his cheek, but no features, just the shape of a face without any detail. My stomach twisted. I gripped the wheel tighter, my pulse hammering in my ears. I had to be imagining it. The storm, the tension, my own paranoia, it was getting to me. A deep breath. Keep driving. 30 minutes passed. The roads were empty, the storm relentless. I felt trapped inside a snow globe, the swirling white outside making it impossible to tell where the road ended and the sky began. And then he moved. Not much. Just a slight tilt of his head. But it was enough. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. We're about halfway there, man. Nothing. I checked the mirror again, but my fingers slipped on the wheel as I sucked in a sharp breath. His head had tilted more. Too much. An unnatural angle, like his neck had been stretched beyond what was humanly possible. And now I could see something beneath his hood. A grin. A wide, unnatural grin stretching across his face. Teeth too sharp, too perfect, too white against the darkness of his skin. My throat dried up. My instincts screamed at me to stop the car, kick him out, get away. But we were in the middle of nowhere. The snowstorm had swallowed everything. I couldn't risk getting stranded. I pressed down on the gas, just a little. The car surged forward. The silence inside the car grew louder, pressing against my skull. I didn't dare look at the mirror again. Didn't dare acknowledge that something was very, very wrong. And then he laughed, a low guttural sound that vibrated through the seat, through my bones. It didn't sound human. It was wet, distorted, like it was coming from deep within his chest. The headlights flickered. The engine groaned. And my phone, dead. The screen, black. Hey, man. I tried again, my voice shaking now. You all right back there? The laughter stopped. The air grew impossibly still. And then finally he spoke. You picked me up before. My fingers clenched the steering wheel so tightly they ached. No, that wasn't possible. I had never seen this man before in my life. I don't think so, man, I forced out. Yes. His voice was like ice, cutting through the space between us. Many times, I didn't answer. I couldn't. I hit the gas harder. The car roared forward, but the road wasn't changing. The same stretch of highway kept repeating. The same crooked road sign, half buried in snow. The same bent streetlight, flickering like a dying heartbeat. We were trapped. I gritted my teeth. No, I wasn't crazy. This wasn't real. I had to get out of this. I slammed my foot on the brake. The tires skidded against the ice, the car jerking violently to a stop. My breath came in ragged gasps. I turned around, ready to order him out, to do anything to break whatever spell was happening. But the back seat, empty. The door hadn't opened. There were no footprints in the snow outside, no sign anyone had ever been there at all. The engine groaned, the headlights flickered, and the world around me seemed to fold in on itself. Then, from the rearview mirror, his face closer, grinning. "See you next time." The car's lights cut out. The storm swallowed everything. And then I woke up, sitting in my parked car, engine off, snow piled high around me. The ride request was still on my screen, unaccepted. But in the back seat, pressed into the frost-covered window, a handprint. Story number 2, the last stop before nowhere. The gas gauge was dipping dangerously close to empty. Snow pelted against my windshield, thick and heavy, swallowing the road behind me. The world beyond my headlights was nothing but an endless stretch of white, the highway lines barely visible beneath the storm. I should have filled up back in town, but I had been in a hurry, eager to get to my destination before the worst of the storm hit. Now I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with only one option: find a gas station before I ended up freezing on the side of the road. Then, as if answering my silent plea, a flickering neon sign emerged through the snowfall. The letters were barely legible, half of them burned out, but I could make out GAS in faded red glow. The station sat alone off the highway, its single pump buried under a layer of untouched snow. No other cars, no tire tracks, just an old crumbling building with yellowed windows. I pulled in, my tires crunching over the ice. The station looked abandoned, but the lights inside were still on. A single attendant stood behind the counter, barely visible through the glass. I hesitated before stepping out, pulling my coat tighter around me as the cold sank into my skin. The air was eerily silent, as if the storm had muted everything around this place. No wind, no distant hum of passing cars. Just me, the gas pump, and that attendant inside, staring at me. I hurried to the pump, swiped my card, and nothing. The screen stayed dark. Frustrated, I tried again, but it was completely dead. Of course, I had no choice but to go inside. The door creaked loudly as I stepped in. The warmth of the small convenience store should have been comforting, but it wasn't. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting an ugly yellow glow over the dusty shelves. The place smelled old, like something had been sitting in here for far too long. The attendant, a middle-aged man with sunken eyes and a gaunt face, didn't speak as I approached. He just watched me, unblinking. "Hey, your pump's not working," I said, forcing a casual tone. "Can I pay inside?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked toward the door behind me, then back to my face. Slowly, in a voice raspy and hollow, he said, "You shouldn't be here." A chill that had nothing to do with the cold slid down my spine. I forced a nervous chuckle. "Yeah, I figured that much, but I just need some gas, and I'll be out of here Oh no," he cut me off, his voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't be here. Not this far. Not at this stop." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I turned slightly, glancing around the empty store. The shelves were stocked, but something was off. The products were outdated, the labels faded, as if they had been sitting there for years, untouched. I turned back to him. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice lower. "There's nothing ahead. No town, no roads that lead anywhere. If you keep driving, you won't come back. A lump formed in my throat. That couldn't be right. My GPS had clearly shown a route. The next town wasn't far. I pulled out my phone, but no service. Just a blank screen, as if I had driven off the edge of the world. The man was still watching me, his gaze heavy with something that looked almost like pity. "Just turn around," he said. "Go back the way you came." I should have listened, but I didn't. Instead, I shook my head. "Look, I just need gas. Please." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, exhaling slowly, he grabbed a rusted key from beneath the counter and handed it to me. "Pump for," he muttered. I nodded, eager to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, he spoke again. "Don't stop for anyone," he warned, "no matter what you see." I stepped outside, the cold hitting me like a wall. My breath clouded the air as I hurried to the pump. The key fit perfectly, and soon gas was trickling into my tank. Relief flooded through me. Then a knock. I spun around. A man stood at the edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the flickering gas station lights. His clothes were thin, not nearly warm enough for this kind of weather. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his face obscured by the darkness. I swallowed hard. "Hey, you okay?" No response. He didn't move, just stood there staring. The words of the attendant echoed in my mind. "Don't stop for anyone." I yanked the nozzle free and jumped back into my car, locking the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The man still hadn't moved. I pulled out onto the road, keeping my eyes straight ahead. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Snow swirled across the highway, my high beams barely cutting through the whiteout. Then I saw it, a shape up ahead, a person standing in the middle of the road. I gritted my teeth. No. I wasn't stopping. I swerved slightly, but as I got closer, my breath caught in my throat. It was him, the same man from the gas station, the same thin clothes, the same unnatural tilt of his head. I slammed on the gas, my tires skidding against the ice, and flew past him. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. He was gone.
I kept driving. The storm thickened, swallowing everything. Then, the neon sign, glowing faintly through the snowfall. My stomach twisted. No, I had just left that gas station. I had driven miles. It wasn't possible. But there it was, the same broken sign, the same empty pump buried in snow. I yanked the wheel, pulling up sharply. My hands were ice cold, gripping the wheel too tight. I wasn't going in. I wasn't falling for this. I checked my phone again. Dead. No signal. Then, in the mirror, movement. My blood ran cold. The gas station attendant stood in the doorway, watching me, and behind him, standing just beyond the light, dozens of figures, thin, motionless, all staring at me. I threw the car into reverse, tires screeching, but as I did, my headlights flickered, and they were closer, right at the edge of the lot. The attendant lifted his hand, slowly, and mouthed one word: "Run." I didn't think, I just floored it. The road stretched ahead, endless and empty. My knuckles were white on the wheel, my breath coming in short gasps. I drove, and drove, and drove, until the sign, GAS, the same gas station, waiting for me. I let out a broken laugh, my chest tightening. I was never leaving. The storm howled around me, and in the mirror, they were waiting. I kept driving. The storm thickened, swallowing everything. Then, the neon sign, glowing faintly through the snowfall. My stomach twisted. No, I had just left that gas station. I had driven miles. It wasn't possible. But there it was, the same broken sign, the same empty pump buried in snow. I yanked the wheel, pulling up sharply. My hands were ice cold, gripping the wheel too tight. I wasn't going in. I wasn't falling for this. I checked my phone again. Dead. No signal. Then, in the mirror, movement. My blood ran cold. The gas station attendant stood in the doorway, watching me, and behind him, standing just beyond the light, dozens of figures, thin, motionless, all staring at me. I threw the car into reverse, tires screeching, but as I did, my headlights flickered, and they were closer, right at the edge of the lot. The attendant lifted his hand, slowly, and mouthed one word: "Run." I didn't think, I just floored it. The road stretched ahead, endless and empty. My knuckles were white on the wheel, my breath coming in short gasps. I drove, and drove, and drove, until the sign, GAS, the same gas station, waiting for me. I let out a broken laugh, my chest tightening. I was never leaving. The storm howled around me, and in the mirror, they were waiting. The air in the room felt heavier, my hands clenched into fists. Something about that voice, something about the way they said it, made my skin crawl. "I think you have the wrong room," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. Silence. Then, in a whisper, "No, I have the right one." Every hair on my body stood on end. I took a step back. "Go away." Another knock, louder this time, impatient. I moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see outside. The storm was still raging, but under the dim glow of the motel's neon sign, I could make out a shadow standing just outside my door. I couldn't see a face, just the outline of a tall figure, their heads slightly tilted like they were listening. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The door handle rattled, my chest tightened. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I pulled up the motel's number. The line rang. Once, twice. Then the old man's voice came through, tired and distant. "Did you open the door?" "No," I whispered. "Someone's out there. They're saying they know me." Silence on the other end. Then a slow exhale. "You need to leave, now." "What?" I choked. "I can't even see the road. It's a blizzard out there." The knocking returned. Harder, faster. The doorknob twisted violently. The voice outside changed. It became deeper, distorted. "You know me. You've always known me." Panic clawed at my throat. "They can't come in," the old man said. "Not unless you open the door." The knocking stopped. I could still feel it standing there, waiting. My pulse roared in my ears. I didn't know what to do. Run? Stay locked inside? The storm outside was brutal, but something in my gut told me I was safer out there than in here. Slowly, I grabbed my bag, my keys, my coat. "I'm leaving," I whispered into the phone. "Don't look at it," the old man said. "No matter what, just get to your car and drive." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Then, unlocking the door, I ran. The cold hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. My boots crunched against the ice, my car only a few feet away. I could feel it behind me. Close, too close. I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming the lock shut. My hands fumbled for the keys, my breath fogging up the windshield. Then, I heard it. A whisper, right outside my window. I knew better. I knew not to look, but I did. And for the briefest moment, I saw its face. Not a stranger's. Mine. The engine roared to life. I tore out of the lot, my tires skidding over ice. The neon sign flickered in my mirror as the motel disappeared into the storm. I drove. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't remember how I made it home, but sometimes, late at night, I hear a knock on my door, and a voice that sounds just like mine whispering, "Hey, it's me." Story number 4, Voices in the Ice. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the frozen branches like brittle bones. Snow stretched endlessly in every direction, a thick white void swallowing the landscape. The lake, frozen solid, gleamed under the pale moonlight, its surface smooth as glass. We had come out here for a weekend getaway, just 4 friends, a rented cabin deep in the woods, and no cell service. It was supposed to be a break from everything, but from the moment we arrived, something about this place felt wrong. The first night it started. It was near midnight, and we were gathered around the fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls. The wind outside had died down, leaving behind an eerie silence. Then, from the direction of the lake, we heard it, a whisper. At first, I thought I imagined it, a faint, distant sound, almost like the wind moving through the trees. But then it came again, clearer, closer. "Did you hear that?" Mark muttered, sitting up straight. We all exchanged uneasy glances. The whispering was soft, almost melodic, like a voice carried on the air. It didn't sound like words, not at first, but there was something about it that felt human. Anna shivered, pulling her blanket tighter around herself. "It's just the wind," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. None of us wanted to admit what we were all thinking. There was no wind. The whispers continued, rising and falling in rhythm, like a conversation just out of reach. My stomach twisted. It was coming from the lake. By morning, the night's unease had faded into something distant, easily dismissed. We chalked it up to exhaustion, paranoia, but I could still hear it in the back of my mind, that sound like something trying to be heard but never quite breaking through. That day, we explored the frozen lake, our boots crunching against the thick layer of ice. It was solid beneath our feet, the deep blue surface smooth except for the occasional crack where the ice had split and refrozen. The lake was vast, stretching out into the fog-covered woods. Then Anna stopped walking. "Guys." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Look." She was staring at something in the ice. We followed her gaze and felt the air turn colder. Beneath our feet, just a few inches below the surface, was a hand. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a shadow, an old branch frozen below. But no, it was a handprint, pressed against the ice from underneath. The fingers were long, unnaturally slender, splayed wide as if someone had reached up and pressed their palm against the ice. My breath hitched. The worst part? There were no cracks, no holes, just smooth, perfect ice. Whatever had made that handprint was still down there. Mark forced a nervous laugh. Someone probably did that before it froze over. But even he didn't sound convinced. That night, the whispers returned. They were closer. I lay in my bed, heart pounding against my ribs, staring at the ceiling as the voices circled the cabin. They weren't coming from the lake anymore. They were in the woods, weaving through the trees, moving closer. I held my breath, straining to hear. This time, I could make out words. "Let us in." My blood turned to ice. The voices were soft, pleading, more than one. They layered over each other, overlapping, desperate.
I squeezed my eyes shut. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Then, a knock. A single hollow knock against the cabin door. I bolted upright. My breath came in shallow gasps. "Did you hear that?" Anna's whisper cut through the dark. Mark was already getting up, moving toward the window. I wanted to stop him, tell him not to look, but he pulled back the curtain, and his body went rigid. "They're standing on the ice," he whispered. I didn't want to see. I really didn't. But something in me, some horrible, morbid instinct, made me move toward the window. Through the frost-covered glass, I saw them, figures, standing on the frozen lake. Their bodies were blurred by the falling snow, but I could make out their shapes, their faces turned toward the cabin. Their mouths were moving, whispering. The worst part? Their feet weren't touching the ice. They were hovering just slightly, their toes barely grazing the surface. A deep, primal fear settled into my bones. "We need to go," I whispered. "But where?" The car was parked a quarter mile up the road. The snow was too thick, too deep to run through. And even if we made it, what if they followed? Then, a crack, a deep, low groan of ice shifting. We turned back toward the window. The figures were closer. Their faces were clearer now, not strangers. United States. Anna let out a strangled gasp. The figures on the ice, they were us. Same faces, same clothes, same wide, unblinking eyes. But their mouths kept moving, whispering. The cabin door rattled. I grabbed Mark's arm. We can't stay here. He nodded, his face pale. We didn't take time to think. We just ran. Throwing on our boots, we shoved the door open and bolted into the night. The cold stabbed at my lungs, my legs burning as we fought through the deep snow. Behind us, I heard footsteps, not crunching against the snow, but dragging. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The car was in sight. I fumbled with the keys, my hands numb and shaking. Mark yanked open the door and we piled in, slamming the locks shut. Silence. The world outside was empty. The lake, the trees, all untouched. No figures, no whispers, like they had never been there. Anna sobbed quietly in the back seat, clutching her arms. We have to go. I started the engine, my hands still trembling. The headlights cut through the snowfall, illuminating the road ahead. And then, for the briefest moment, I saw it in the rearview mirror, not in the distance, not by the lake, in the back seat. A whisper right against my ear. Let us in.
Story number 5. My roommate wasn't real. I first met Ryan the day I moved into my dorm. Snow piled high against the windows, muffling the sounds of students moving in down the hall. My breath fogged in the air as I lugged my suitcase inside, rubbing my hands together for warmth. The heater was barely working, the room small and dimly lit, but at least I wasn't alone. Ryan was already there, sitting on the bed by the window, staring outside. His hair was dark, his face pale, and when he turned to look at me, his lips barely curled into a smile. "Hey," I said, tossing my bag onto my bed. "You must be Ryan." He nodded slowly. "Yeah." His voice was quiet, almost distant. The silence between us stretched longer than it should have. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the unease settling in my stomach. "Where are you from?" I asked. He turned back to the window. "I don't really remember." I chuckled awkwardly. "That bad, huh?" He didn't answer. Something about him felt off, but I brushed it aside. Maybe he was just shy, or maybe I was overthinking things. Either way, I was too exhausted to care. I unpacked quickly, then collapsed onto my bed, staring up at the ceiling as the heater rattled in protest. That night, I woke up freezing. The heater had shut off completely, leaving the room coated in an unnatural chill. My breath curled in the air, and my fingers were numb as I pulled the blankets tighter around me. Then, I noticed it. Ryan wasn't in his bed. The sheets were still perfectly made, untouched, like no one had ever slept there. I sat up, shivering, my eyes adjusting to the dark. The room was silent, the only sound my own uneven breathing. Then, movement. A faint shadow flickered by the window. I turned sharply, my heart slamming against my ribs. The window was covered in frost, but in the dim glow of the campus lights outside, I swore I saw something shift, a shape, a reflection. Ryan, standing outside, staring in. I lunged for the light switch, flooding the room with yellow light, but when I turned back to the window, nothing, just an empty, snow-covered ledge. My stomach twisted. There was no balcony outside our window. We were on the 3rd floor. I barely slept after that. The next morning, Ryan was back, sitting on his bed, staring out the window as if nothing had happened. "Dude," I said cautiously, rubbing the exhaustion from my eyes. "Where were you last night?" He turned slowly, blinking at me. "What do you mean?"
A long silence stretched between us. Then finally he laughed. Software hollow. That's not possible, he said. I didn't press it. I didn't want to. Days passed. The storm outside grew worse, the snow piling higher, sealing us into a frozen world. Ryan barely spoke. He never left the room, and yet somehow I always felt like I was alone. It was small things at first. His bed was never messy. His side of the room never had clothes, books, or any sign that he actually lived there. Then there were the voices. Late at night, just as I was slipping into sleep, I would hear them. Whispers, low and urgent, just beneath the hum of the heater. At first, I thought they were coming from the dorm next door, but then I realized they were coming from Ryan's bed. One night, I finally worked up the nerve to check. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, flipping on the flashlight. The beam landed on his bed. Empty. My stomach lurched. I turned my phone toward the closet. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of blackness beyond the frame. The whispers stopped. The air in the room felt thick, pressing against my skin, making it hard to breathe. I forced myself to move, stepping toward the closet with slow, shaky steps. I reached out, pushed the door open. Nothing, just darkness. I exhaled sharply, relief washing over me. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe the whisper came from right behind me. I spun, my flashlight flickering over the room, but there was no one there. Ryan's bed was still empty. The only sound was the wind howling against the window. I didn't sleep after that. The next day, I skipped classes and went straight to the dorm office. The RA on duty barely looked up as I approached. I need to ask about my roommate, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He sighed, rubbing his temples. What about him? Ryan, I said. Ryan Carter, something off about him. I hesitated. I didn't know how to say it. I don't think he ever leaves the room. The RA finally looked up. His expression was blank. Who? I swallowed hard. Ryan Carter, my roommate. Room 312. The silence that followed was deafening. The RA's face paled slightly. There's no one assigned to that room except you. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. I shook my head. That's not possible. He's been there since I moved in. The RA pulled up a file on his computer, his eyes scanning the screen. You were given a single. He turned the monitor toward me, pointing at the listing. My name. Only my name. A thick, suffocating dread settled in my chest. I stumbled back, my pulse roaring in my ears. That night, I didn't go back to my room. I crashed on a friend's floor, my mind spinning with everything that had happened. The voices, the window, the empty bed. But the next morning I had to go back. My stuff was still there. The hallway was colder than usual. The door to 312 loomed ahead, slightly ajar. I hadn't left it open. I pushed it open slowly, my breath shallow. The room was exactly the same. My bed, my desk, my scattered belongings, but Ryan's bed, it was gone. The blankets, the pillows, the neatly tucked sheets, all of it, like no one had ever been there. I stepped inside, my hands trembling. The air felt different, lighter, empty. Then the heater clicked on. The low hum filled the silence, and for the first time since I arrived, I realized something. The whispering was gone. I don't know who or what Ryan was. I don't know if he ever really existed at all, but sometimes, on cold winter nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I still hear my name, whispered from inside the closet. Story number 6. The man outside my window. The first time I saw him, I thought it was just my imagination. It was late, past midnight, and I was the only one left in the office. The winter storm outside had turned the city into a ghost town, the streets buried under thick layers of snow. The wind howled against the windows, rattling them in their frames. I had been staring at my screen for hours, my eyes burning from the harsh glow, when I leaned back and stretched. That's when I saw him. A figure standing outside. He was just beyond the reach of the street lights, standing completely still on the snow-covered sidewalk, a dark shape against the swirling white. At first I thought he was looking up at the building, maybe just a random passerby braving the storm, but something about the way he stood, too still, too patient, sent a chill crawling up my spine. I leaned closer to the glass, squinting through the frost. The moment my eyes adjusted, my stomach twisted into a knot. He was staring directly at me. I jerked back, my heart hammering. The office was on the 5th floor. There was no way he could see me, and yet I felt it, his eyes locked onto mine. The wind outside howled louder, the snow whipping against the windows in furious gusts. I blinked, and he was gone. I let out a shaky breath, rubbing my temples. I had been working too long, that was all. My brain was playing tricks on me. Pushing the unease aside, I grabbed my coat, shut down my computer, and hurried out. The next night, he was there again. This time, I saw him the moment I turned off my monitor. The reflection in the dark screen showed a silhouette, standing in the same spot, his body rigid, his face obscured by shadows. My blood ran cold. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. He hadn't moved, hadn't shifted an inch. The street was empty except for him, the snowfall piling up around his feet. Then he tilted his head. A slow, deliberate movement, like he was acknowledging me. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed security. The line rang once, twice, then static. A sharp burst of garbled noise before the call dropped entirely. I turned back to the window. He was closer, not on the sidewalk anymore. Now, he stood beneath the streetlight, his face still hidden in shadow, but I could see his mouth. A smile, too wide, too sharp. My chest tightened, every instinct screaming at me to get out. I didn't bother shutting down my computer this time. I grabbed my things and sprinted for the elevator, stabbing the button repeatedly, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The doors slid open, and I practically threw myself inside, slamming the close button. As the door shut, I glanced toward the window one last time. He was standing at the entrance to the building. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smile. I told myself it was just a hallucination, stress from too many late nights at work. But the next morning when I arrived at the office, something made my stomach drop. There were footprints in the snow. They led from the sidewalk directly to the front door. That night I told myself I wasn't going to look. I was going to finish my work, keep my head down, and leave before it got too late. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. A little after 11, I couldn't help myself. My hands were cold as I reached for the blind, slowly peeling it back just enough to see outside. At first, he wasn't there. Relief washed over me in a shaky exhale. Maybe he was gone. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Then, the light above my desk flickered, and in the reflection of the window, I saw him, standing right behind me. I spun, my chair scraping against the floor. The office was empty. The breath hitched in my throat, my pulse a deafening roar in my ears, my fingers dug into the desk, my body trembling. I forced myself to turn back to the window, my heart stuttering. He was outside again, but this time he wasn't alone. More figures stood in the snow, their bodies rigid, their faces obscured by the darkness. They stood in perfect silence, unmoving, as if waiting for something. A sharp, slow knock echoed through the empty office. I nearly choked on my own breath. It wasn't from the entrance. It was from the window. 5 floors up. I bolted. I don't remember how I got home. I don't remember the drive, the icy roads, the blizzard that swallowed the city. All I remember is locking every door, every window, and crawling into bed. My body curled into itself like a child hiding from a nightmare. But nightmares end. This didn't. The next day, I called in sick. I ignored the endless buzzing of my phone, the emails piling up. I didn't care. I wasn't going back. Then, just past midnight, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. I stared at it, dread coiling in my gut. Against every ounce of reason, I answered. At first, there was only silence. Then, breathing. Slow, deep, deliberate. And then a voice, low and too close. You left the window open. The line went dead. I sat frozen, the phone slipping from my hand. The room was silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Then, behind me, the window creaked open, and in the reflection of the glass, that smile. Story number 7, the attic door that won't stay shut. The first time I found the attic door open, I blamed the wind. The old house had been sitting empty for years before I moved in, and the winter storms had a way of making everything creak and groan. Snow piled high against the windows, muffling the world outside, leaving me alone in the heavy silence. It was late, past midnight when I noticed it. The attic door, a narrow wooden hatch in the hallway ceiling, was slightly ajar. A black sliver of space gaped open above me, cold air whispering down like a breath. I stared at it for a long time, heart pounding, before dragging a chair from the kitchen and standing on my toes to push it shut. The latch clicked softly into place, and for a moment, the unease in my chest eased. But the next night, it was open again. This time, I knew for a fact it had been locked. I had checked it before going to bed, and yet, there it was, gaping open like a waiting mouth, the darkness inside stretching deep and endless. I stood beneath it, my breath misting in the cold air. The house was silent, but the silence felt wrong, too heavy, too expectant. I grabbed a broomstick and nudged the hatch shut again, forcing the lock to click. Then, just to be sure, I dragged a chair beneath it. If it opened this time, at least I'd hear it. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house set my nerves on edge, my ears straining for the sound of wood shifting overhead. The wind howled against the walls, but beneath it, I swore I heard something else, a slow, rhythmic tapping. By morning, the chair had been moved. It wasn't knocked over. It wasn't pushed aside. It was simply placed back against the wall, like someone had carefully set it down, and the attic door was wide open. My stomach twisted. I stood there, staring up into the darkness, my pulse hammering against my ribs. There was no way I had done that. No way. I should have left. Packed a bag, driven into town, found a motel, but something about the house kept me there. A twisted curiosity, maybe. A need to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. That night I locked the attic door again, but this time I placed a strip of duct tape over the latch. If it opened, I'd know. I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like nails dragging against wood. My skin prickled as I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The room was freezing, colder than it had been the night before. My blanket felt damp, my fingers numb as I reached for my phone. 3:12 a.m. The scratching grew louder. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, every muscle in my body tense. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house, above me, the attic. I stepped into the hallway, my pulse hammering so loudly I could barely hear my own footsteps. The cold air made my breath fog in the dim light. The attic door was open. The tape had been peeled away in a perfect, clean strip. It lay curled on the floor, as if someone had removed it, with careful, deliberate hands. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, but my feet wouldn't move. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight from my desk and pointed it toward the open hatch. Something moved. I didn't see it. Not fully. Just the hint of a hand. A pale, bony hand. Fingers too long, disappearing into the shadows. My body finally caught up with my brain. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over myself, as I scrambled for the door. My keys. I needed my keys. Then I heard it. A voice. Small. Childlike. Please, don't shut the door. My blood ran ice cold. I didn't wait. I didn't respond. I grabbed my coat, my keys, and ran. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked at the edge of the long, winding driveway. The house stood in the distance, dark and silent. The attic hatch, a gaping hole in the ceiling. Snow continued to fall, covering my windshield in a thick, blinding sheet. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Stress, exhaustion, isolation. The mind plays tricks in the dark, especially in a house like that. But when I stepped back inside, the air felt different, lighter. The attic door was closed. The tape was gone. I forced myself to check. I dragged the chair beneath the hatch and climbed up, flashlight shaking in my grip as I shined it into the attic. It was empty. Nothing but dust and old wooden beams, no footprints, no signs that anything or anyone had been there. For a moment, I almost laughed. Maybe I really had imagined it. Maybe. Then I saw it. In the farthest corner, tucked away in the dust, sat a rocking horse. It was small, carved from dark wood, its paint chipped and faded. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. As I stared, it rocked, slowly, back and forth, a single rhythmic creak. I climbed down, shut the attic door and nailed it shut. That was 3 weeks ago. I don't go near that hallway anymore. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is quiet and the house is still, I hear it, the rocking, moving, waiting. Story number 8. The hand that pulled me under. The snowstorm had swallowed the highway, turning the road into an endless white void. My truck's headlights barely cut through the thick snowfall, the high beams reflecting off the ice-covered pavement. I had been driving for hours, the rhythmic hum of the engine the only thing keeping me grounded. The world outside was silent, eerie, like I had driven straight into another realm. I hadn't seen another vehicle for miles. No rest stops, no exit signs, just an endless stretch of road that seemed to loop in on itself. The gas gauge was dipping lower, but I knew there had to be a place to stop soon. Then, like an answer to my silent plea, I saw the dim glow of a rest stop sign flickering through the storm. I pulled in, my tires crunching over the snow. The place was completely empty. A single streetlight buzzed overhead, casting weak yellow light onto the lot. There were no other cars, no footprints in the snow, Just an old restroom building and a vending machine humming quietly in the cold. I killed the engine and let out a slow breath. My muscles ached from sitting too long, and the warmth inside the cab was making me drowsy. Just a quick break, I told myself. Stretch my legs, clear my head, maybe grab a coffee from the vending machine. The wind howled as I stepped out. The cold hit me like a wall, sinking deep into my bones. Snowflakes stuck to my jacket, melting against my skin as I trudged toward the restroom. The door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior, lined with cracked tiles and rusted sinks. The silence was deafening. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to shake off the creeping exhaustion. My reflection in the mirror looked worse than I felt. Eyes bloodshot, skin pale. I needed sleep, but the road ahead was still long. Then, just as I reached for a paper towel, I felt it. A hand on my ankle. A sharp, icy grip. Fingers like iron clamps closing around me. I barely had time to react before I was yanked off my feet. My head hit the tile hard, a sharp crack exploding through my skull. The world spun as I gasped for breath, my hands scrambling against the slick floor. I kicked out wildly, my boot connecting with something solid. The grip loosened. I scrambled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I twisted onto my hands and knees. My heart hammered in my chest, my pulse roaring in my ears. The stall door in front of me was wide open. It had been closed when I walked in. I was sure of it, but now it stood ajar, revealing nothing but darkness. A low scraping sound echoed from within, slow, deliberate, like nails dragging against the tile. I staggered to my feet, my vision swimming. My ankle throbbed, an aching frozen pain sinking deep into the bone. My fingers trembled as I pulled out my phone, flipping on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, landing on wet footprints, bare footprints, leading from the stall, leading toward me. I didn't think, I just ran. The cold air hit me like a sledgehammer as I burst out of the restroom, my boots slipping against the icy pavement. My truck sat where I left it, the door still slightly ajar. I lunged forward, throwing myself inside, slamming the lock down with shaking hands. The silence was suffocating. I could still feel it. The lingering touch of those fingers, the freezing burn on my skin. My breaths came in sharp gasps as I fumbled for the ignition. The engine groaned before roaring to life, the heater blasting uselessly against the deep, unnatural cold that had settled inside the cab. Then a thud, a single heavy thud against the truck's undercarriage. My blood turned to ice. I sat frozen, gripping the wheel so tightly. My knuckles turned white. The truck was idling. I hadn't moved, so what had just hit it? The answer came too quickly. Another thud. Closer. Like something was crawling up from underneath. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I forced myself to move, to shift into reverse, but my hands felt numb, my limbs heavy. It was like something was wrapping around me, draining the warmth from my body. Then, a handprint, right on the windshield. It bloomed against the frost, spreading outward like something was pressing against the glass from the inside. The fingers were long, unnaturally thin, tipped with sharp points. I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the ice, the truck lurching backward as I gripped the wheel, my heart threatening to claw its way out of my chest. Then, movement in the rearview mirror, a shape crawling out from beneath the truck, not walking, crawling. Its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, its eyes locked onto mine, black pits stretching impossibly wide. I hit the gas again, harder. The truck lurched forward, the wheels catching against the road, and I sped out of the rest stop without looking back. The highway swallowed me. The snowstorm raged on, but I could still feel it. The weight under my truck, the thing that had latched onto me. I drove for hours, hands shaking, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that grinning, hollow-eyed face staring back at me. By the time I reached the next town, the storm had eased. The gas station lights were a welcome sight, warmth and life in the middle of the frozen wasteland. I pulled in, my body running on pure adrenaline, barely able to process what had just happened. Then, as I stepped out, something made me stop cold. My boots crunched against the snow, but there were other footprints. Not from my tires, not from the road. Bare footprints, leading from under my truck and disappearing into the dark. Story number 9. Someone was living in my basement. The first time I heard the noises, I thought it was just the old pipes. The house was over 100 years old, and the winter cold made everything creak and groan. The wind outside howled through the trees, rattling against the windows, and the snow had piled high against the foundation, locking me inside like a tomb. I had only been living here for a few weeks, renting the place for cheap, after my job relocated me to this small, nearly abandoned town. The basement was unfinished, nothing but cold cement and rusted pipes running along the walls. I never had a reason to go down there, and I preferred it that way. The air down there always felt different. Thick and stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The single bare light bulb flickered whenever I had to switch it on, casting long, unnatural shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. That night, the sound was different. It wasn't just the groan of old pipes or the settling of the house, it was a cough. I had been lying in bed, barely drifting off, when I heard it. Faint, muffled, like someone clearing their throat in the dark. My entire body went rigid. I held my breath listening, telling myself it was the wind or my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again. Closer. A slow, deliberate cough, followed by something even worse. Shuffling. Something moving beneath me. My heart slammed against my ribs as I sat up, straining my ears. The floorboards beneath my feet felt impossibly thin, like a barrier too fragile to separate me from whatever was below. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and tiptoed toward the basement door. It sat at the end of the hallway, a heavy wooden thing with a rusted knob that always stuck when I tried to open it. The air grew colder as I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling. I pressed my ear to the wood. Silence. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was overtired, paranoid. But as I turned to walk away, I heard it again. A cough. Then footsteps. I stepped back, my pulse hammering. The footsteps were slow, measured, like someone was pacing. I swallowed hard, debating whether to run or call the police. But who would believe me? That my empty, abandoned basement was suddenly occupied? I made a choice. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. The air that rushed out was stale, thick with the scent of damp concrete. I stood frozen, staring down the narrow wooden staircase, my phone's flashlight cutting through the dark. At the bottom of the stairs, just beyond the reach of my light, something moved. I nearly dropped my phone. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, standing at the bottom of the stairs. I couldn't see its face, just a shape, unmoving, watching. A sharp, choked breath escaped me. I stumbled back, gripping the doorframe for support. My mind raced with explanations, a squatter, a break-in, something human, but my gut told me otherwise. The figure didn't react, didn't flinch. It just stood there, as if it had been waiting. Then, it stepped forward. I slammed the door shut and locked it. For a long time, I stood there, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my back pressed against the door. The silence in the house felt heavy, suffocating. I half expected something to knock from the other side, but nothing came. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen gripping a knife, my ears straining for the slightest sound, but the house remained still. By morning, I convinced myself that it had been my imagination, a trick of the dark, a combination of exhaustion and paranoia. But when I finally worked up the courage to check the basement again, I noticed something I hadn't before. A plate, sitting on the cold concrete floor, pushed up against the far wall. An old ceramic plate, its edges chipped, crusted with something rotten, and next to it, an empty water bottle. Someone had been living down here. The police came an hour later. They searched the basement thoroughly, finding nothing but dust, cobwebs, and that damn plate. No signs of forced entry. No hidden passageways. Nothing to explain what I had seen. They chalked it up to a squatter who had found a way in and escaped before I noticed. But that didn't explain what happened later that night. I was in my bedroom, the snowstorm raging outside, the house locked up tight. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my skin prickled with the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I turned my head toward the open closet. And there, just barely visible through the slats of the door, were two eyes staring back at me. Story number 10, the girl who vanished at the gas station. The gas station was the only sign of life for miles. The storm had swallowed the highway, turning everything beyond my headlights into a swirling white void. My fuel gauge had been dipping lower for the past hour, the little warning light flickering like a heartbeat. If I didn't stop now, I'd be stranded in the middle of nowhere. I pulled into the station, my tires crunching against the ice. The place looked old, barely holding itself together. A single flickering light buzzed above the pumps, casting long, distorted shadows across the snow. The store's glass door was fogged over, the neon open sign barely glowing through the frost. There were no other cars, no footprints, just silence. I stepped out, the cold sinking into my skin immediately. The wind carried the distant sound of rustling trees, but something about the air felt wrong, too still. I hurried to the pump, swiped my card, and waited. That's when I heard it. A soft sniffle. I turned, my breath curling in the frigid air. Near the corner of the building, half hidden in the shadows, stood a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 7 or 8. Her coat was thin, her hands bare, her long hair matted with bits of ice. She wasn't wearing gloves, no hat, just a small, frail thing trembling in the cold. I hesitated, glancing toward the store. No clerk in sight, no other customers, just the girl. "Hey," I called gently, "are you okay?" She didn't move, didn't blink. I stepped closer, feeling the creeping unease claw at the back of my mind. "Where are your parents?" Her lips parted slightly, like she wanted to speak, but nothing came out. Her breath fogged in front of her face, vanishing into the night. The gas pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. I turned for barely a second to grab the nozzle. When I looked back, she was gone. My stomach twisted. I stepped forward, scanning the lot. She couldn't have run that fast. The snow was untouched, smooth as glass. There were no footprints. A cold weight settled in my chest. I hurried toward the store, my boots slipping against the ice as I yanked the door open. The bell above jingled weakly, the warmth inside wrapping around me like a blanket. The cashier, an older man with deep lines on his face, looked up from his magazine. I wasted no time. There was a little girl outside. She looked lost. Do you know? Before I could finish, the man's expression darkened. He set the magazine down slowly. You saw her? Something in his tone made my stomach clench. Yeah, she was just... I gestured toward the lot. She was right there. Now she's gone. The man exhaled through his nose. He didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked tired. She always comes back when the snow's deep, he muttered, rubbing his temple. A cold chill wrapped around my spine. What do you mean, always? He stood, stepping around the counter. You need to leave. I was old. Shouldn't we look for her? I stared at him. He wasn't joking. His face was pale, his eyes heavy with something unspoken. A sick feeling twisted in my gut. What happened to her? The wind outside rattled the glass. The lights overhead flickered. The man's gaze shifted toward the door, his jaw tightening. She died. I felt my breath catch. A long time ago, he continued. She and her mother broke down on the highway, same as you. Came in looking for help. By the time anyone found them, the storm had buried their car. The mother didn't make it. His voice dropped lower. Neither did the girl. My hands felt numb. Then, who did I see? The cashier didn't answer right away. He just looked past me, toward the darkened lot outside. His next words were quieter. She always asks for help. The bell above the door jingled. A gust of cold wind blew in, chilling me to the bone. But the door, it hadn't opened. I turned slowly, my heart hammering. The store's entrance was shut tight. The windows were fogged over, the night outside thick with snowfall. But in the reflection of the glass, just faintly, she was standing behind me. I spun, my pulse slamming against my ribs. Nothing, just empty aisles, stale air. A dead silence stretching between me and the cashier. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. Get in your car, he muttered. Drive. Don't stop, not until you're far from here. I hesitated. I didn't want to believe him, but the fear curling in my chest was undeniable. Every instinct screamed at me to listen. I backed toward the door, my breath uneven. If she comes back, what happens? The man didn't look at me. He just shook his head. She doesn't stop looking. The storm howled as I stepped outside. My car sat in the lot, half buried in snow. The gas pump stood untouched, the hose still hanging loose. Then I saw them. Footprints, tiny bare footprints leading from where the girl had stood, directly to my car. My chest tightened. I climbed into the driver's seat, slamming the lockdown with shaking hands. My breath fogged against the windshield as I turned the key, the engine coughing to life. The store lights flickered. The world outside blurred in a haze of white. Then, just as I shifted into drive, a tap against the passenger window. Software delicate, like small fingers pressing against the glass. I didn't look. I couldn't. My foot hit the gas, and I tore out of the lot, snow spraying behind me. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless. My hands were ice cold, gripping the wheel too tightly. I didn't check the mirrors, didn't stop, didn't breathe, until the gas station was nothing but a distant glow swallowed by the storm. Hours passed before I pulled into the next town. My body felt numb, my thoughts tangled. I forced myself to breathe, to steady my hands, before stepping out of the car. The footprints were gone, but on my passenger window, barely visible against the frost, were the faintest smudges, as if someone had been sitting in the seat beside me. Story number 11. My date's face changed. The restaurant was quiet, the kind of place where the candles flickered low, and the waiter spoke in hushed tones. The storm outside had sealed the world in thick white snow, muffling the streets, leaving only a few lingering customers inside. I had arrived early, nervous but excited, checking my reflection in my phone screen while waiting for her to show up. Her name was Claire. We had matched on a dating app a few weeks ago, exchanging messages that had quickly turned into long conversations late into the night. There was something about her. She was funny, intelligent, and had a way of making even the most mundane topics feel important. Meeting in person felt like the next logical step. When she arrived, I was struck by how much she looked like her pictures. Almost too much. Her face was perfect, symmetrical, like an airbrushed version of reality. She smiled as she slid into the seat across from me, shaking the snow from her coat. "You made it," I said, relieved. She tilted her head slightly. "Of course. Why wouldn't I?" There was something odd about the way she said it, but I brushed it off. First date nerves, I told myself. We started talking, and soon I found myself relaxing. She was just as charming in person, her voice smooth and even. The candlelight flickered between us, casting long shadows against the tablecloth. Then, and the power flickered. Just for a second. The lights dimmed, the restaurant falling into brief darkness, before humming back to life. It happened so fast that no one seemed to react, except for Claire. When the lights returned, she was staring at me. Not in a curious way, not in a way that said she was interested, in a way that said she was waiting. I felt my stomach twist. Something about her face, her eyes maybe, felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the longer I looked at her, the more unfamiliar she became. I forced a smile. "So, what do you do for work?" She hesitated, just for a beat. "I told you already," she said smoothly. "Don't you remember?" I frowned. I thought back to our conversations. Had she told me? I couldn't recall. Had she ever actually said what she did? "Right," I lied. "Of course." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The waiter arrived, setting down our drinks. I thanked him, wrapping my fingers around the glass, grateful for something to hold on to. Claire, however, didn't move. She hadn't even touched her menu. "Aren't you going to order?" I asked. She blinked, as if the thought hadn't occurred to her. Then, slowly, she picked up the menu, scanning it with eerie precision. "I'll have what you're having," she said finally. The waiter nodded and walked away, and for a moment we sat in silence. I tried to shake the unease. Maybe she was just socially awkward. Maybe the storm had thrown her off. But then I noticed something else. Her glass. It was completely still. Not a single ripple, no condensation. I had been holding mine for only a few minutes, and already there was a thin layer of frost from the cold air. But hers looked untouched. I swallowed hard, forcing a laugh. "So, Claire, tell me something about yourself I don't know." She tilted her head again, watching me with too much focus. "You already know everything," she said. A sharp chill ran through me. "What do you mean?" She leaned forward slightly, her hand still resting in her lap. "We've talked for hours. Haven't we? You know me. I know you. Her voice was calm, but there was something underneath it. Something wrong. I nodded slowly. Right. But the power flickered again. This time the darkness lasted longer, a full second, and when the lights came back, Claire's face was different. Not drastically, not like a mask being ripped away, but her features were slightly off. Her eyes, just a bit too large. Her nose, slightly too sharp. Her mouth, the corners pulled back just a fraction more than they should be. It was her, but it wasn't. My grip on the glass tightened. I tried not to react. I tried to pretend I didn't notice. The restaurant felt colder. The voices of other diners faded into the background, muffled, distant. Claire was still staring at me, waiting. Waiting for what? I forced a smile. So, any vacations planned? She smiled back. No. That was it? Just no. The waiter returned with our food. Claire didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his presence. She just kept watching me. Then, as the waiter set my plate down, I saw it. A reflection in the window beside us. But not ours. My reflection sat stiff, shoulders tense, face pale. But Claire's was wrong. Her mouth was open too wide, much too wide, stretched in a grin that exposed too many teeth, and her eyes, black, empty. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head slightly, trying to see her face directly, but in the real world, she still looked normal, or close enough to it. But in the reflection, she was grinning at me. Slowly, she picked up her fork, still staring. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. A few people glanced over, but no one seemed to notice anything wrong. I need to use the restroom, I muttered. Claire didn't blink, didn't break her gaze. I'll wait, she said. I nearly tripped over myself getting out of there. The hallway leading to the restrooms was dim, the overhead light flickering slightly. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone. I pulled up our old messages, scanned through them, and that's when I saw it. I had never asked Claire to meet in person. She had never suggested it either. And yet, here she was. A sharp, cold dread settled into my chest. I clicked on her profile, my fingers trembling. It didn't exist. The name, the pictures, gone, like she had never been there at all. A soft creak echoed from behind me. I turned slowly. Claire was standing at the end of the hall, still smiling. But now, her face had changed again. Her skin stretched too tight, her eyes completely black, her mouth wider than humanly possible. You shouldn't have left the table, she whispered. The lights flickered one last time, and everything went dark. If you made it this far, you're braver than most. But tell me, have you ever experienced something like this? A moment that made your blood run cold? Share your horror stories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this nightmare, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss what's lurking in the dark. There are more chilling stories waiting for you. Click on the videos appearing on your screen now. But be careful. Some things are better left unseen.